Hello friends, welcome to AI Flux. So Apple just gave us an AI Christmas morning just a few days early. So what does this mean? They've announced and officially released their ML Ferret model. So this is actually one of the first fully multimodal models coming out of Apple. We know they've been spending millions of dollars on their AI developments, playing catch up with other larger FAANG companies. And we've also been hearing sort of inklings that iOS 18 might actually be an AI focused release. The important thing here is that as Apple continues to be kind of at the forefront of having an ML platform, both built in software and for hardware, there are a lot of similarities that are emerging between iOS and macOS. So for instance, improvements in AI for iOS basically directly correlate to improvements for macOS and vice versa, since everything is running on Apple Silicon. And with advancements like MLX, which are now, after just a few weeks, already showing to have really cool deployments. Like for instance, Google's Phi 2 coding model runs on MLX. Also, Mixtral 8x7b, not even in just 4-bit quantization, is running in MLX. Basically, with Llama and these other tools and the ever-improving tooling from Apple, there are fewer and fewer models that you can't just run on Apple Silicon. And there are a lot of interesting takeaways from this Ferret model in terms of what Apple actually built on to accelerate, but I think there are a lot of really cool developments here. So I want to get into what is Ferret, why is it important, what is it good at, what is it maybe not so good at, how it was built, and some other stuff that I think Apple should have talked more about, but they can only talk about so much in these releases. So let's get into it. So I think I can speak for most of us and say that Siri is really kind of dumb. No one really actually uses it. And at this point, I'm pretty common that a 4-bit quantized 7B model would probably provide better responses than 90% of whatever Siri would give back to you. And when we think about how Apple thinks about this development, we have to think about cycles. And Apple generally works on 2- and 4-year cycles, either in software or in hardware. And as we can see, they've incrementally been increasing the number of neural compute cores in all of their silicon, and with that, the capability at all of their devices. And I think we're still very, very early in one of these 4-year cycles for AI, which is why I mentioned that iOS 18 is really slated to be kind of an AI first and AI focused release. And I don't want to get into which specific models I think would kind of stand in as a super AI Siri. Something closer to Phi 2 and the new MLX optimizations make that look way, way more capable. But Ferret gives us a huge insight into this because it shows us what Apple is actually building with, what they're training with, how they're deploying these tools, and then moreover, how they're actually packaging these to run on Apple devices. I think what's also cool is they are kind of starting to form some industry standards in terms of models that are meant to do certain things specifically and then certain things not so specifically. So yes, Apple has a GitHub page. They have a lot of cool stuff here. And for some of you who've been following this stuff a bit more closely, you're going to say, oh, well, Ferret was actually announced months ago. And yes, technically, Apple did announce some of these AI projects when they were trying to show how much they were playing catch up. And technically, yes, Ferret was announced in October, but we couldn't see anything, we couldn't use it, and now we have it in its full form. And what I do like about Apple is when they do release these things, they are fully open sourced, and they did basically stick to their word. So as you can tell, yes, like parts of this repo were here a few months ago, and very recently did they finally make all of this public. This was not a public repo just a few days ago. So what is Ferret? Ferret is something that Apple calls a refer and ground anything anywhere at any granularity model, or an end-to-end MLLM or multimodal large language model that accepts any form referring and ground anything in response. So basically here, they're saying that it's multimodal, right? So the idea is you can interact with image input and some other embeddings and actually interact with images, right? That's the whole idea of having this be multimodal. So it's an LLM, it can understand images, it can understand parts of images as well. And basically, if I have to be frank here, they're basically saying, yes, like you can specify a part of an image, use that as context in a prompt, and then actually use that to interact with what's going on here. So what are the key contributions? The key contributions here are the Ferret model itself, so this hybrid region representation and spatial aware visual sampler. This is pretty much the input pipeline for the MLLM, and I should just warn you, there are a lot of acronyms that have MLLM and L's and U's in them. So I'm going to try to keep those consistent. They use the GRIT dataset, which is a dataset that's actually been sort of enhanced by Apple. They've used this before, so clearly they like this kind of grounding. And then what I think is also interesting is they focused on Ferret Bench. And this is a curious trend sort of coming out since, when Google released Gemini, they announced the creation of MMLU, which was actually their benchmark for their systems. And Although this seems biased, and I think a lot of these kind of are biased, because a lot of these benchmarks are tuned to actually show the best attributes of a model. So although, they are benching other models with these benchmarks, they're still generally created to make whatever company who created the benchmarks, LLMs, look best. However, I think this is better than having third parties do it, because when third parties do it, you're ending up with the same amount of bias, and in certain cases, it's harder to understand where it's coming from. And here we go. So basically, the raw code for Ferret was released on October 30th, and on the 14th, they released some of the checkpoints, and now we have the full tooling. Previously, you couldn't actually kind of train and run this from scratch. Now you can. And it's important to note that all this currently is just for research purposes. So the installation is pretty straightforward. They let you just download the whole repo. All the checkpoints are included. If you have Python 3.10, it's pretty straightforward. And they also use Ninja and Flash Attention, which is kind of interesting. Now, one thing I think is very interesting is Apple, even being Apple, right, with as big as they are, even they are not quite able to escape the massive benefits that NVIDIA have in terms of tooling. So this is all trained on 8 A100 GPUs with 80 gigs of memory each. They say here that to train on fewer GPUs, you can reduce your per device train batch size and a few other attributes, and you can probably train smaller. You're not going to train on a MacBook. That's pretty well established here. But yeah. And what's really interesting is they use a similar set of hyperparameters as Llava or Vicuna in fine-tuning. So this model isn't a wildly new thing, but it is something that Apple has built up from scratch. They say here that before you start, the base model is literally Vicuna, which is an instruction-tuned chatbot. So you start with that, and then you actually start training Ferret. And there are two versions you can aim for. There's both a 7B and a 13B. I would say it's not a huge stretch to assume that 7B is intended for roughly to be put on iOS devices, and 13B being anything not an iOS device. Obviously, you're still training these with NVIDIA GPUs, but in terms of inference, you can run them in theory wherever you want. And for the Ferret demo, Apple, again, just in the idea of speed, they used the Gradient Web UI. It's all based with the idea of workers. So what's interesting is right now, you do actually need a CUDA GPU to run this. And since I just saw this, I'm actually going to get this up and running on a GPU and make a separate video for you guys to show that. But basically, for now, if you've messed with Vicuna, you probably have a pretty good sense of what's going on here. And what I do think is interesting is this model has certain attributes that really remind me of Segment Anything, because one attribute of what they use to build this, specifically this sort of region name coordinates feature extraction, is why this can actually segment as well as establish different subjects in an image. And this isn't super surprising to me because Apple already on your iOS device has deployed a number of these sort of block models. Now I say block models because they're starting with small pieces and then slowly growing them. So for instance, Apple iOS devices all have the ability to understand where pets are in images. They also have one of the biggest local classifiers for plants. So no cell service, you can take an image in photos and with a few swipes, understand which of, about, I think like 200,000 different plants the plant in your image might be, which I think is pretty cool. And I like how Apple kind of has a practical first approach to this, which is different than kind of Meta and Google's approach, right? Meta and Google make huge reaches with models that are pretty rough around the edges, and Apple really likes to create very clear product vision and then create things that directly derive value on their devices and on their hardware. If we're being honest, what happened at Meta is they're kind of dog fooding and recycling a lot of research from the metaverse to now call it AI and basically not lose money on a lot of development costs. So I can't wait to get this demo up for you guys. If I do it on Google Colab, I will post a link to that as well. We're probably going to see some from other people who are even much better at doing this than me. But I'm very excited about this model. Any announcements from Apple, I always take very seriously because they take their word very seriously. And I think it's a cool direction to see now that both Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive are out of the picture, and Apple is really having to find new direction with their platform. And I think being an AI-first platform is pretty cool, especially since Apple, like with all their products, still is taking a product-first approach and a value-first approach. So not necessarily kind of like what Samsung does with phones, where they just do like gimmicky features first and hope people buy them for that. Apple is like, no, we want people to have clear value and clear capability with their devices, and we want to be the best platform for AI development and deployment. So I think this is really cool. Definitely let me know what you guys think in the comments below, if there are any bits of this you actually want to see. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, please like, subscribe, and share, and we'll see you in the next one.